May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Get behind me, Satan. It's a good line, isn't it? Get behind me, Satan. When I've used it or heard it used, it's almost always been in jest, used to playfully rebuke temptation or of some kind or another. Get behind me, Satan. Such a great phrase. I use it as often as I can in casual conversation. But looking once again at the biblical context, something much deeper is going on here, all humor aside. This is a serious matter. I can just imagine the conversation that ensues when Peter pulls Jesus aside. It was probably sort of like the conversations that many of us have had after we find the courage to speak a difficult truth, after we point out something that others don't really want to see, after we refuse to gloss over pain or struggle, after we name what's really going on in a difficult situation. Hearing Jesus say that things aren't going to end well just isn't what Peter wants to hear. It's not going to keep the morale of the disciples up, and it's certainly not going to help them recruit new followers. No one wants to join up with someone who's predicting his own failure and demise. I just imagine Peter, come on, Jesus, chin up, man. It's all going to be okay. Let's just get on with things. I'm guessing Peter's rebuke might have sounded something like this, the power of positive thinking 101. But Jesus knows where things are heading, if not in full, at least in part. He knows that his enormous popularity with the masses is going to make him unpopular with the authorities. He knows his success means that things are about to take a turn and get really, really complicated. There have already been signs. Jesus is just reading them. Jesus simply refuses to lead people on, you see. He refuses to pretend he's on anything other than a collision course with the powers and principalities. And not just the corrupt powers occupying Palestine, but also the powers of cosmic evil, the forces of rebellion against all that is good and holy. Indeed, for Jesus, it was infinitely important to tell the truth. So he refused the tyranny of positive thinking, refused to offer false hope, insisted on seeing things as they were. All of which was likely so very hard for the disciples. I'm guessing they had started this journey with high hopes that they were following the next big name in Judean spirituality. It must have been so very thrilling to show up in a new town and be overrun by fans, to be following a man who could heal the sick and cast out demons. How could it all end in the way that Jesus was suggesting? They were doing so much good, helping so many people, offering hope to the hopeless. To imagine it all ending calamitously felt impossible, unthinkable. So Peter told Jesus to stop it with the negative thinking. Get on with it. You're already behind on the miracle quota for the day. People need you, Jesus. Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan, Jesus says. Have you not yet understood? There is no winning on this journey. There is no building up of the self. There will be little prestige, few accolades. This is the path of downward mobility. And we still don't quite want to hear it. We still want to rebuke Jesus, tell him that his version of things is dead wrong. We want a sunnier kind of faith. Just like the disciples, we tend to set our minds not on divine things, but on human things. We still don't want to believe that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. because it's hard to believe that our successes might not really count, because we've tried so very hard to be first, because we've convinced ourselves that winning is everything. So we want a Jesus who is more tolerant of our ambitions. But here comes Jesus bursting our bubble yet again. It is tiresome, isn't it? Irritating and not very polite. Who does this Jesus think he is anyway? But of course, Jesus knows exactly what we need. He knows that winning is just about killing us. And he knows that we must be willing to risk loss to experience the fullness of life, to experience life on the other side of fear and anxiety. And so Jesus says those words that we'd rather not hear, those words that we really wish he had kept to himself, because we really don't want to suffer any more than we absolutely have to. And we don't really understand why God would have designed the process of liberation in this way. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. So what might it mean this year in particular to take up our crosses? As I've prayed on Jesus's words, I've begun to wonder if they're less about courting suffering and more about relating differently to the suffering that is already part and parcel of our lives. I don't know about you, but my impulse is always to push suffering away. I tend to rail against it, reject it. I tend to feel that suffering is disrupting how things should really be, the easier, simpler life that I really deserve. But all the energy that I put into rejecting suffering doesn't really do much good. It doesn't necessarily make the suffering go away. It doesn't lessen its sting. In fact, it often makes things feel even harder. And so I wonder this Lent, in the midst of such a difficult season in our world, in which there is so much suffering in us and around us, whether there might be a different way to relate to suffering. I wonder if we might somehow find the courage to take up our suffering, if we might cradle our suffering gently and try to get to know it a bit better. And in so doing, I wonder if we might be able to find a little more ease, a little more freedom in how we relate to all the inevitable suffering of this life. It's so very counterintuitive to willingly take up our cross, take up our suffering. And yet perhaps there is also great wisdom in doing so. Because in this life, suffering doesn't seem to be optional, but how we relate to it can make all the difference in how we relate to ourselves and to one another. So if you decide that this Lent is the right time to get better acquainted with suffering, the right time to take up the crosses of your life, know that Jesus is with you all the way to hell and back, and that he will never forsake you. May it be so. Amen.